I've always been the responsible one. While my sister Emma painted watercolors and dreamed of art galleries, I was in boardrooms learning profit margins. While she dated musicians and actors, I stayed late reviewing contracts. When Mom died 10 years ago, I was 20, and Dad needed someone to help run Morrison Construction. Emma was only 16, still grieving, still a child, so I dropped out of my MBA program at Northwestern and came home. Just for a year, Dad had promised, until we get back on our feet. That year became 10. I learned every aspect of the business, from reading blueprints to negotiating with contractors, from managing payroll to securing city permits. Dad would pat my shoulder and say, "Don't know what I'd do without you, kiddo." But when clients asked about succession planning, he'd always deflect. Plenty of time for that later. Emma graduated high school and went to art school in California. Dad paid every penny without blinking. When she wanted to study abroad in Paris for a semester, he wired the money that same day. When she decided to switch her major from painting to sculpture, requiring all new expensive equipment, Dad just smiled and said, "Follow your dreams, sweetheart." I never begrudged Emma her freedom. She was the baby, the creative one, the one who still remembered Mom's laugh. I was the practical daughter, the one who could read a P&L statement and spot discrepancies in vendor invoices. I told myself this was enough. I told myself I was making a difference. But somewhere along the way, I started preparing for disappointment. Maybe it was the way Dad's business partners always looked past me during meetings, even though I was the one who'd prepared their presentations. Maybe it was how he'd introduce me as my daughter who helps out, while Emma was always my youngest, the artist. Or maybe it was the gradual realization that being indispensable wasn't the same as being valued. 5 years ago, I quietly registered Everest Holdings as a Delaware LLC. I told myself it was just contingency planning, a way to protect my own interests if Dad ever decided to bring in outside investors. I used a different address, listed myself as the sole member, and funded it with money I'd saved from my modest salary. Every major deal Morrison Construction made, every partnership we formed, every contract we signed, I made sure Everest Holdings was positioned as a potential buyer or partner. I wasn't planning revenge, I was planning survival. Emma met Derek at a gallery opening in Malibu 2 years ago. He was everything Dad wanted in a son-in-law, handsome, wealthy, connected. His family owned a chain of luxury hotels across the West Coast. Within 6 months of dating, Derek was joining us for Sunday dinners, charming Dad with stories about his family's business empire and their philanthropic endeavors. "Oh, that boy's got a good head on his shoulders," Dad would say after Derek left. "Not like these artsy types Emma usually brings around." I watched as Emma transformed herself for Derek. Gone were her paint-stained clothes and bohemian jewelry. She started wearing designer dresses and talking about finding balance between art and family responsibilities. When Derek proposed with a 5-carat diamond, Dad cried actual tears of joy. "Finally," he said to me privately, "Emma's settling down with someone who can take care of her properly." The comment stung more than I expected. I'd been taking care of myself, and him, and the business for a decade. But apparently, that wasn't the kind of care that mattered. The engagement period was a whirlwind of wedding planning that somehow became my responsibility. Emma was too overwhelmed by all the details, and Dad was too busy with work. So I coordinated with caterers, florists, photographers, and the venue staff at the Fairmont. I negotiated contracts, managed timelines, and handled the guest list that kept growing as Derek's family added more names. "Just put it all on the company card," Dad said when I showed him the invoices. "This is my baby girl's special day." The wedding budget exceeded $200,000. I knew because I was the one tracking every expense, every deposit, every final payment. The company's cash flow could handle it, but barely. We'd had to delay some supplier payments and push back a few equipment purchases. 3 weeks before the wedding, Dad started acting strange. He'd take phone calls in his office with the door closed, something he'd never done before. He'd leave for meetings without saying where or with whom. When I asked about a contract renewal that needed his signature, he'd say, "Handle it later, Cate. I've got bigger fish to fry." The biggest red flag came when Harold Weinstock, our family attorney for 30 years, started showing up at the office. Harold handled wills, trusts, estate planning, Not construction contracts. But suddenly he was meeting with Dad every few days, always with thick folders of documents. Just updating some paperwork, Dad said when I asked. You know how lawyers are, always finding something to fix. But Harold wouldn't meet my eyes anymore. When I said hello, he'd nod politely and hurry past. This was the man who'd taught me to play chess during long summer afternoons at his lake house, who'd given me my first legal textbook when I showed interest in business law. His sudden coldness felt like a warning. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered Dad had been liquidating some of our smaller investments. Nothing dramatic. A few CDs here, some municipal bonds there. When I questioned him about it, he got defensive. I'm not required to run every financial decision past you, Cate, he snapped. I built this company. I know what I'm doing. It was the first time he'd ever spoken to me like that. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a certainty I didn't want to acknowledge. I started quietly copying important files, backing up financial records, documenting everything. I told myself I was being paranoid. I hoped I was being paranoid. The rehearsal dinner was held at the country club, Derek's family's choice. His parents, Robert and Catherine Pemberton, held court like minor royalty, regaling the guests with stories of their European vacations and charity galas. Emma glowed beside Derek, looking every inch the perfect society bride-to-be. I sat at a side table with some distant cousins, watching Dad work the room. He was in his element, shaking hands with the Pembertons' wealthy friends, name-dropping projects Morrison Construction had completed for other prominent families. I'd seen him do this dance before. The working-class boy made good, proving he belonged in their world. Your father's quite the success story, Robert Pemberton said to me during cocktails. Building a company from nothing, providing for his daughters. Emma tells us you've been helping him all these years. Helping felt like such a small word for what I'd done, but I smiled and nodded. It's been a learning experience. Well, I'm sure you'll figure out your own path eventually, Catherine Pemberton added with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. Not everyone's cut out for business. Emma's found her calling in art, and now she'll have Derek to handle the practical matters. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, where I stared at my reflection and tried to calm the rage building in my chest. These people saw me as Dad's helper, Emma's spinster sister, a placeholder until the real family took over. And maybe that's exactly how Dad saw me, too. The wedding day dawned perfect. Clear skies, 70 degrees, not a cloud in sight. The Fairmont's ballroom had been transformed with thousands of white roses and twinkling lights. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's elite, all there to celebrate Emma and Derek's union. I wore a navy blue dress that Emma had approved, not too flashy, but still elegant, and I spent the morning handling last-minute crises. The florist had forgotten the boutonnieres, the photographer was running late, and 2 of Derek's groomsmen had hangovers that required emergency hangover cures. Where would we be without you? Emma said, squeezing my hand as I fixed a problem with her veil. For a moment, she looked like the little sister I remembered, vulnerable, grateful, loving. You'd figure it out, I said, meaning it. You always do. The ceremony was beautiful. Emma looked radiant walking down the aisle on Dad's arm, and Derek's face when he saw her was everything a bride could want. I found myself tearing up despite everything, remembering the little girl who used to dance around the living room in Mom's old dresses pretending to be a princess. But during the reception, as the champagne flowed and the speeches began, I noticed Dad checking his watch repeatedly. He kept glancing toward the back of the room where Harold Weinstock sat with his wife, nursing a whiskey and looking uncomfortable. When the best man finished his toast, Dad stood up. The room fell quiet, all eyes on him. He looked distinguished in his tuxedo, every inch the proud father of the bride. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. This is the happiest day of my life. Seeing my baby girl marry such a wonderful young man, surrounded by all of you. Well, it doesn't get much better than this. The crowd murmured appreciation. Emma beamed up at him from the head table. But tonight isn't just about celebrating Emma and Derek, Dad continued. It's also about celebrating new beginnings, new chapters, and new opportunities. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I set down my champagne glass and focused completely on his words. As many of you know, I've spent the last 30 years building Morrison Construction from the ground up. It's been my life's work, my legacy. But all good things must come to an end, and it's time for me to step back and let the next generation take over. My heart started pounding. This wasn't part of any speech we'd discussed. I'm thrilled to announce that Morrison Construction has been sold to Everest Holdings for $50 million. The room erupted in surprised murmurs and applause. I felt the blood drain from my face. The sale closes Monday morning, Dad continued, raising his champagne glass higher. And I want to be absolutely clear about something. This money will secure Emma and Derek's future, along with any grandchildren they might bless us with. He turned to look directly at me, his expression hardening. Cate, I know you've worked hard over the years, and I appreciate everything you've done. But this is about family legacy, about ensuring the Morrison name continues through Emma's children. You're 30 years old, unmarried, with no prospects for a family of your own. This money needs to go where it will do the most good. The words hit like physical blows. Around me, I could hear people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some were whispering behind their hands. A few looked genuinely shocked by Dad's public announcement. So, Cate, Dad concluded with what I'm sure he thought was paternal firmness. You get nothing, but don't worry. Derek's already offered you a position in his family's business. I'm sure you'll figure something out. The applause was scattered and awkward. Most people seemed unsure whether they should clap for what sounded more like a public disowning than a retirement announcement. I sat there for a moment, processing what had just happened. 10 years of my life reduced to, you get nothing in front of 200 people. A decade of sacrifice dismissed as helping out before the real family took over. But instead of the rage or devastation Dad probably expected, I felt something else entirely: relief, clarity, and a strange kind of joy. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than they had any right to be. The room fell silent again, all eyes turning to me. Dad lowered his champagne glass, suddenly looking uncertain. Congratulations on the sale, Dad, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. $50 million is a good price. I have one question, though. Dad nodded warily. Who exactly is the buyer? This Everest Holdings? I don't think I'm familiar with them. Dad's chest puffed up with pride again. He probably thought I was giving him a chance to save face, to elaborate on his business acumen. Everest Holdings is a very reputable firm, he announced to the room. They specialize in acquiring family businesses and helping them grow to the next level. Very professional, very established. I nodded thoughtfully. That does sound impressive. And they're paying $50 million cash? That's right, Dad beamed. Full payment upon closing. Harold has reviewed all the contracts. Everything's ironclad. I picked up my champagne glass and held it aloft. The crystal caught the light from the chandeliers, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. Well then, I said, raising the glass higher, I should properly introduce myself to everyone here. The confusion in Dad's eyes was almost comical. Around the room, guests leaned forward, sensing drama but not understanding its source. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, my voice strong and clear, I am Everest Holdings. The room didn't just go quiet, it went completely silent. You could hear the ice settling in water glasses, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Dad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, horrible understanding. I incorporated Everest Holdings 5 years ago, I continued conversationally. Delaware LLC, fully legal, properly registered. Every major contract Morrison Construction has signed in the past 5 years includes clauses positioning Everest Holdings as a preferred buyer in case of sale. Dad's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Emma's face had gone white as her wedding dress. The papers you signed yesterday, Dad, the ones Harold witnessed, they transfer 100% ownership of Morrison Construction, along with all related assets, to Everest Holdings. To me. I took a sip of my champagne, savoring the perfect temperature, the delicate bubbles. Oh, and just so we're clear, the $50 million? That includes the house, the cars, your personal accounts, everything you put up as collateral to guarantee the sale. Harold advised against it, but you insisted you wanted to show good faith." The silence stretched on. 200 people sat frozen, witnessing what had to be the most spectacular family implosion in recent memory. Dad found his voice first. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You can't. Harold would have told me." "Harold did tell you," I said gently, "multiple times. You have all his emails warning you to read the contracts carefully, to consider getting independent counsel. You were so eager to close the deal and announce it tonight that you signed everything without actually reading it." Derek started to stand up, probably to defend his new father-in-law, but Robert Pemberton put a hand on his arm, keeping him seated. The old man's eyes were calculating as he watched the scene unfold. "You did this deliberately," Dad said, his voice growing stronger with anger. "You've been planning this. You've been lying to me for years." "I've been protecting myself," I corrected. "And honestly, I hoped I'd never have to use it. But tonight, in front of all these people, you made it clear exactly what you think of me, of my contributions, of my future. So now we all know where we stand." I set down my champagne glass and picked up my purse. "The sale is final, Dad, legally binding. But don't worry, I'm not vindictive. You'll keep your job at Morrison Construction with a very fair salary. Emma, your trust fund is safe. I set that aside years ago. Derek, your family's hotels will continue to get preferential pricing on our construction services." I started walking toward the exit, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "Cate, wait!" Emma called out, finally finding her voice. "You can't just— This is my wedding!" I turned back to face her, this beautiful sister I'd protected and provided for, who just sat silently while our father publicly humiliated me. "You're right," I said. "This is your wedding, your day, your choice of husband, your choice of dress, your choice of flowers, all paid for by the company I now own. Enjoy your honeymoon, Emma. It's going to be the last vacation someone else pays for." The room remained frozen as I walked out, my head high, my steps confident. Behind me, I could hear the beginning of chaos. Shocked whispers, scraping chairs, Dad's voice rising in desperate anger. But I didn't look back. For the first time in 10 years, I was walking toward my own future. The first call came at 6:30 Monday morning, 3 hours before the scheduled closing. Dad's voice was hoarse, probably from a sleepless weekend. "Cate, we need to talk. This whole thing, it's gotten out of hand. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. We can work this out." I was already dressed and reviewing the final transfer documents in my home office. 5 years of preparation had led to this moment, and every detail was perfect. "The closing is at 9:30, Dad. Harold has all the paperwork." "God damn it, Cate." His composure cracked. "I'm your father. You can't just steal my life's work because you're having some kind of tantrum." "I'm not stealing anything," I said calmly. "You offered it for sale. I bought it. Everything was done legally, with proper representation. Harold warned you to read the contracts." There was a long pause. When Dad spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, more desperate. "Please, I built that company from nothing. It's all I have left of your mother. She wanted it to be our legacy." That almost broke my resolve. Almost. But then I remembered his words at the wedding. "You get nothing." Mom died 10 years ago, Dad. I've been building that company ever since. Every major client we have, every successful project, every innovation that's kept us competitive, that was me. You know it, the employees know it, and our clients know it. But I don't understand why you did this. Why you set up this shell company. Why you've been planning this for years. What did I do wrong? I could have listed everything. The casual dismissals, the way he'd introduce me as just helping out. The assumption that I'd sacrifice my life indefinitely for a family that saw me as expendable. Instead, I chose honesty. 5 years ago, you had a meeting with the Hendersons about their hotel project. Remember? It was a $40 million deal, the biggest we'd ever landed. I'd spent months developing the proposal, building the relationship, solving their design challenges. I could hear him breathing on the other end. When they came to sign the contract, Mr. Henderson asked you about succession planning. He wanted to know who'd be running things when you retired. You laughed and said you hoped Emma would marry someone with business sense who could take over eventually. You said it right in front of me like I wasn't even there. I didn't mean... That night, I went home and registered Everest Holdings. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I realized I needed to protect myself. And every month since then, you've done something to confirm I made the right choice. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. So, what happens now? You come to work Monday morning like always. Nothing changes for the employees. Nothing changes for our clients. The only difference is that decisions get made by someone who's actually been making them for years. And the $50 million is exactly what the company is worth. You'll be paid in full, as agreed. Another pause. Cate, I'm sorry. For Saturday night, for everything. I was trying to secure Emma's future, but I went about it all wrong. Yes, you did. Is there any way, can we find a compromise? Maybe you could keep the company, but we split the money somehow. Emma's going to need to learn that actions have consequences. I cut him off. And that marriage isn't a career plan. I hung up and finished my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the city gold through my apartment windows. In 3 hours, I'd officially owned the company I'd been running for a decade. The thought should have felt triumphant, but mostly it felt sad. The closing went exactly as planned. Harold looked like he'd aged 5 years since Saturday night, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by professional resignation. Dad arrived late, his face drawn and his hands shaking slightly as he signed the final documents. Cate, Harold said privately as we waited for the wire transfer to confirm, I want you to know I advised against this structure repeatedly. Your father was determined. I know you did your best, Harold. This isn't your fault. He nodded sadly. Your mother would be proud of you, you know. The way you've built this business, the way you've handled yourself. But she'd also be heartbroken about how it came to this. The wire transfer confirmed at 10:47 a.m. Morrison Construction officially belonged to Everest Holdings, which meant it belonged to me. Dad received a cashier's check for $50 million, the full purchase price as agreed. What are you going to do with it? I asked as he stared at the check. I don't know, he admitted. Pay back Emma's trust fund, I suppose. Maybe travel. I always wanted to see Ireland again. It was the first time in years I'd heard him talk about something he wanted rather than something the business needed. That sounds good, Dad. He looked up at me then. Really looked at me, like he was seeing me for the first time in years. I raised a hell of a businesswoman, he said quietly. I just wish I'd been smart enough to recognize it sooner. The phone started ringing before I even got back to the office. Word travels fast in our industry, and by Tuesday morning everyone knew Morrison Construction had new ownership. But the calls weren't what I'd expected. Cate, this is Jim Patterson from Patterson Development. Heard about the ownership change. Frankly, we're relieved. We've been hoping to work more closely with you for years. Steve Morrison's a good man, but you're the one who's been delivering results. Our board voted yesterday. We want to double our project volume with you this year. Is it true you're taking over operations? Because if so, we'd like to discuss that mall project we shelved last year. You had some ideas that could really work. By Wednesday, I had 5 new project proposals on my desk and 3 requests for expansion into markets we'd never considered. Our competitors were scrambling, trying to poach clients they assumed would jump ship. Instead, our client retention rate was holding at 98%. It's like they were waiting for this, said Maria Santos, our head of operations, as we reviewed the week's developments. Half these clients have been asking for you specifically for years. People want to work with decision makers, I replied. They got tired of running everything through intermediaries. The only dark spot was Emma. She'd called twice since Monday, both times in tears, begging me to reconsider. Derek, apparently, was having second thoughts about marrying into a family that had just lost its fortune in such a spectacular fashion. His parents are being so cold, Emma sobbed during Thursday's call. They keep asking about prenups and financial disclosures. Derek says it doesn't matter to him, but I can tell he's embarrassed. What did you think would happen, Emma? I thought you were just angry. I thought you'd cool off and we'd work something out. I never thought you'd actually go through with it. You sat there and listened to Dad tell 200 people that I was worthless, that I had no future, that I deserved nothing. You didn't say a word. I was in shock. It was my wedding day. I didn't know what to do. You could have stood up for me. You could have told him he was wrong. You could have reminded him that I've been keeping that company alive for 10 years. Silence on the other end. Instead, you smiled and accepted his plan to cut me out completely, so now you get to live with the consequences. Cate, please, I'm sorry. I know Dad was wrong. I know you deserved better. But I'm your sister. Doesn't that count for something? It did count for something. It counted for the trust fund I'd protected, the wedding I'd paid for, the decade of sacrifice I'd made to give her the freedom to find herself. But it apparently didn't count enough for her to defend me when it mattered. Your trust fund is safe, Emma. You'll never be homeless or hungry, but the free ride is over. It's time for you to figure out what you actually want to do with your life. The real test came 3 weeks later when Robert Pemberton requested a meeting. Derek's father arrived at my office with the bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way, but his approach was surprisingly respectful. Miss Morrison, he began, settling into the chair across from my desk. I'll be direct. My son is having second thoughts about this marriage. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you orchestrated this entire situation to destroy your sister's engagement. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Robert Pemberton was a shrewd businessman who'd built his hotel empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking. He wouldn't have come here without a purpose. Mr. Pemberton, I orchestrated a legal business transaction to protect my interests. If that affected Emma's personal relationships, those are consequences she needs to navigate herself. The family my son was planning to marry into no longer exists, he continued. The financial security, the social connections, the business partnerships, all gone. All transferred to someone much more capable of managing them, I corrected. He smiled then, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. You know, I've been asking around about you this week, talking to clients, vendors, industry contacts. The consensus is unanimous. Morrison Construction has been yours in everything but name for years. That's correct. My hotels have used 3 different construction companies over the past decade. Morrison Construction consistently delivered the best results, on time and under budget. I always assumed that was your father's doing. It wasn't. No, I'm beginning to understand that. He leaned forward. Here's what I'm thinking. My son may be too proud to marry Emma now, but I'm a businessman first. I want to work with Morrison Construction going forward, regardless of family drama. I nodded. We'd welcome that partnership. But I'm also a father. Derek is my only son, and despite his current stupidity, I love him. If he walks away from Emma because her family lost money, he's not the man I raised him to be. What are you suggesting? A compromise. You've made your point, brilliantly, I might add. Your father has learned his lesson. Your sister understands her situation. But families shouldn't destroy each other over money. Some families destroy themselves, I replied. Money just reveals what was already broken. Robert studied me for a long moment. You're right, of course. But sometimes what's broken can be repaired if people are willing to do the work. And sometimes it can't. True. But shouldn't they get the chance to try? I thought about Dad's call that morning. The third one this week where he'd simply asked how I was doing without mentioning business or money or favors. I thought about Emma's last voicemail, where she'd talked about applying for a job at a local art gallery instead of asking me to fix her problems. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Pemberton? A wedding gift from your company to the happy couple. Something substantial enough to restore their financial security, but structured in a way that makes it clear this is your choice, your generosity, not an entitlement. And in return, Derek marries Emma as planned, with his family's full support. Your father gets to walk his daughter down the aisle without losing face completely, and you get to be the gracious sister who chose forgiveness over revenge. It was a smart proposal, one that would solve everyone's immediate problems while positioning me as magnanimous rather than vindictive, but it would also undermine everything I'd worked to accomplish. No, I said simply. Robert blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct refusal. Emma needs to learn that actions have consequences, I continued. Dad needs to understand that people aren't disposable just because they're family, and Derek needs to decide if he loves Emma enough to marry her without her father's money. You're willing to destroy your sister's happiness to make a point? I'm willing to let her create her own happiness instead of depending on other people to provide it for her. Robert stood up, straightening his suit jacket. You're either the smartest woman I've ever met, or the coldest. Why can't I be both? He laughed despite himself. Fair enough. The offer stands if you change your mind. After he left, I sat alone in my office looking out at the city skyline. 5 floors below, construction crews were working on our latest project, a mixed-use development that would house families, provide jobs, and revitalize a struggling neighborhood. Real work, meaningful work, work that mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Derek called off the wedding. I hope you're happy. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad either. I was something else entirely. Free. 6 months later, Morrison Construction had its best quarter in company history. We'd landed 4 major projects, hired 20 new employees, and expanded into 2 adjacent markets. Our reputation for quality and reliability had never been stronger. Dad worked 3 days a week now, handling client relations and mentoring younger employees. He'd taken that trip to Ireland, spent a month tracing family genealogy and visiting distant cousins. When he came back, he seemed lighter somehow, more present. I forgot how much I used to enjoy the actual building, he told me one afternoon as we walked through a job site. Somewhere along the way, it became all about the money and the status. I lost sight of why I started doing this in the first place. Emma had surprised everyone by not only getting the gallery job, but excelling at it. She'd organized 2 successful exhibitions and was dating the gallery owner, a divorced father of 2 who appreciated her artistic eye and didn't care about her family's financial drama. I'm learning to paint again, she told me during one of our monthly lunches. Not for anyone else, just for me. I'd forgotten how much I loved it. Derek had indeed married someone else, a pharmaceutical heiress his parents had introduced him to 6 weeks after calling off his engagement to Emma. The wedding was featured in 3 society magazines and looked perfectly appropriate and perfectly cold. Bullet dodged, Emma said when she saw the photos. Can you imagine spending the rest of my life at charity galas, pretending to care about people I can't stand? As for me, I'd moved into a new office, the corner suite that used to be Dad's. The view was spectacular, and the space felt right in a way his never had. On my desk sat 2 photos, one of Mom and Dad from their early days when they were young and struggling and building something together, and one of Emma and me as children covered in paint after helping with a home renovation project. The intercom buzzed. Ms. Morrison? There's a reporter here from Construction Weekly. Something about a feature story on women in leadership? I smiled. 6 months ago, no one would have thought to interview the daughter who just helped out. Now I was fielding calls from industry publications, speaking at conferences, and mentoring other women trying to break into construction. Send her in. Change, it turned out, was like any other construction project. You started with a strong foundation, you planned carefully, and you built something that would last. Sometimes you had to tear down what wasn't working before you could build what would. Sometimes you had to choose yourself first, even when, especially when, no one else would. The reporter was young, eager, probably fresh out of journalism school. She set up her recorder and pulled out a notebook filled with questions about breaking glass ceilings and overcoming industry bias. Ms. Morrison, she began, what would you say to other women who feel overlooked or undervalued in family businesses? I thought about Dad's public dismissal, Emma's silent complicity, the decade I'd spent proving myself to people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their consideration. I'd say that sometimes the best thing you can do for your family is refuse to accept the role they've assigned you, I replied. Growth requires discomfort, change requires courage, and sometimes love requires boundaries. Even if those boundaries hurt people you care about? Especially then. Outside my office windows, the city hummed with possibility. Somewhere out there, Other daughters were being told they weren't enough. Other women were sacrificing their dreams for families that took them for granted. Other people were accepting less than they deserved because it felt safer than demanding more. But not me. Not anymore. I'd learned that owning your worth meant more than knowing your value. It meant being willing to collect on it, even when the people you loved tried to convince you that you were asking for too much. Especially then,